Hey guys, this is James. Welcome to, I think we're calling ourselves the Film Fellas.
We've officially been branded.
Yeah.
The Film Fellas.
We don't know how it's spelled yet, if it's Fellas, or maybe that is the only way to spell it, as opposed to like the Film Fellows.
Oh, wow.
We have very professional. I don't think we're high class enough for that
Maybe.
yet.
We haven't. Yeah, we'll have to get down to the nitty gritty.
Yeah.
I like that though.
So, welcome to episode 3, and so, what movie did we watch this time around?
So today we're going to be discussing Hoop Dreams, which I think for us was the highest rated basketball movie on the IMDb page. Definitely probably the most famous and well known. Hoop Dreams, released in 1994, follows the story of two inner city Chicago youth who essentially tells the story of them and their dream to play NBA basketball.
Yep. And so the two kids became sort of like affected by the story, and they became, because the film did so well, that they became known as like the two kids that were in Hoop Dreams and stuff. So it kind of has been like a story that's followed them around throughout their lives. And I believe they're still in Chicago. William Gates and Arthur Agee.
Yeah, Arthur Agee.
Yeah, were their names. So, and it was filmed over the course of, I think, 4.5 years. Is that right?
4.5 years. As we initially see them going between their 8th grade year going into 9th grade, and essentially stay with them all the way until they go off to college. So I think they had about 4.5 years of filming, of which we see about 4 of it, a window of about 4 years.
Yeah.
From I think 1989 to about 1993.
Yeah, and then the film was officially released in 1994, and then there's kind of like brief notes about where they were at that point in their lives and stuff like that. And you can, of course, look at Wikipedia or search the internet to find out how they're doing today.
Yeah.
So what did you think of this film in general?
Yeah, so this was interesting because I had seen, I think I'd seen Hoop Dreams from start to finish once, and then bits and pieces of it, but this was probably the most concentrated I'd been on the film, and just picked up a lot of different things. One of the things we were talking a lot about was just the intimacy that we see high school basketball, especially in a competitive market like Chicago, where there's so many different NBA players that are being produced. One of the high schools that William Gates goes to is famous for having Isaiah Thomas come out of. So you're just really intimately seeing this culture of like a market of especially inner city kids who are expected to be produced into these NBA players. And so one of them goes to a private school, and one of them, well, they both go to private school to start off, and then one of them ends up leaving for the public school. So I was really fascinated with that dynamic, and we talk a little bit about that around the just the process of these families having their kids recruited to come to the private school, but when they get there, they're really just good to the school as long as they're good for the basketball team.
Yeah, and it's like a big, like, it's like they would never be going to the school if it weren't, like, it's far away, it costs a lot of money, if it wasn't because they were good at basketball. And it's sort of like, thinking back, it's sort of like a theme that's also visited in He Got Game a little bit, except from high school to college, in the sense that, like, Ray Allen goes there, there's, like, a lot of white people around and stuff like that. It's very different from his sort of normal home life. And so it's kind of a similar dynamic in some sense.
Yeah, it actually made me think also of those scenes from Blue Chips when that college coach is recruiting, and pretty much deeply invested in these families for nothing more than the fact that their sons are good at basketball. And we see this in a very intimate reality for these two families, and their kids' dreams to play in the NBA.
Yeah, and I think one of these narratives or the themes that the film does really well at developing is just capturing the different agendas that a lot of the players have. It's like the coach, and it's like a view that we more closely associate with college coaches, is like really in it to like for his own good.
Yeah.
Like, and that's how he showed.
Yeah.
At least,
to go down state, as they say, which was to win that Illinois state championship was his primary agenda.
And interestingly, just talking about this film, it's actually oddly enough reminding me of Boyhood a little bit, just in the sense that it's like, it's a very naturalistic feel to it. Boyhood was obviously not a documentary, but it had that sort of like feel that you're following this kid throughout time and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And this definitely has that same sort of feel.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely feel like we were able to watch these two kids grow up, especially, we talked about this, Arthur Agee, to watch his watch him mature. He comes in, he's just his stature is small and his maturity level is pretty. I would say he's pretty immature from the start of the film, and then to kind of watch him grow up and mature as a basketball player, but also as like a man, was interesting.
Yeah, and William Gates kind of starts out like the same size that he ends up being.
Yeah.
He's like 6'1", and
Yeah.
Arthur Agee starts out as, what did you say, 5'6", 5'7"?
He's about 5'6", yeah.
Yeah, and then he may be taller than William Gates by the end of the film.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like, that's a very normal thing. Some kids grow sooner than others, and so...
yeah, it was just fascinating to watch that process, because we were introduced to him in the film as this small, kind of scraggly, immature kid, and by the time he leaves, he's, like, got a kid, and he's, like, 6'3".
Yeah, or no, it was Gates that had
Gates had a kid, yeah.
But, yeah, I mean, like you say, we see, like, a lot of the life pass them by, so to speak. So, interestingly, I actually first heard about this film when I was just getting into movies and stuff like that, and it was about 11 or 12 years ago at this point, and so, like, you search the internet and stuff, you run into, like, top 10 lists and stuff. So one of my favorite films back then, and still now, was Pulp Fiction, which was released in 1994. And so I actually saw a top 10 list at that time, Ebert's top 10 list from, like, the 1990s. And Pulp Fiction was listed at number 2. And I was always curious about the film that was number 1, which happened to be Hoop Dreams.
Okay.
So it was on my radar. I don't remember why I didn't watch it then. I don't know. Maybe the library just didn't have a copy, or I couldn't find a download link. But I was excited to finally get the chance to see this film in the last few weeks. And... yeah, and I really liked it for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think that having watched it again, that I didn't process so much the first couple of times is seeing the kind of narrative and wondering about, we talked a little bit about this, but how many, the story is, I guess you could say, a universal story in some sense. This desire to go on and play in the NBA, especially going into the inner city Chicago, where there's so many people who've come out who've had this dream, and it becomes like this dream that's really pumped into like a lot of these young men.
Yeah.
And obviously not all of them are going to make it, and most of them won't make it. One thing I was curious is we see William Gates go to these basketball camps, and I think we recognize a couple of the NBA players who were there. Future NBA players. Jalen Rose was there. Was there another player?
There probably was, but I don't.
Yeah.
I don't specifically remember.
And obviously, there's just like hundreds of these kids. This was like a all-American camp, and only a couple of them are going to make it. Though, it's sort of what all of these kids go all in on. There wasn't really a plan B for Arthur or William that we see, at least. It was like they were going to make it to the NBA. Their coaches were confident that if they bought into the high school system, they'd send them to the NBA. And the reality is that, I think as the title says, that's kind of just a dream that doesn't amount to the reality.
Yeah, exactly. The dream, I think the movie is very aptly named, so to speak. And yeah, like you were saying, it's like throughout the film, there's like one of the supporting characters, you could say, is like Michael Jordan. In the sense that we're constantly seeing him on TV, we're seeing the Bulls win their first couple championships in the background. Like in Chicago in like the early 90s, basketball was in.
Yeah.
And it was for these kids a dream or a way out. And I mean, you could argue whether or not it's like a unrealistic dream or whatever, but the fact of the matter is both of these kids actually did end up going to colleges when in all likelihood, well, I don't want to say that they wouldn't have, but the opportunities open to them would have been very different. So it's like a way out in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's true. We were talking about also wondering, I think both of these stories for William and Arthur had a lot of interesting storylines along them. Arthur going into the private school and then getting kicked out, William having some issues with his knee, but kind of maintaining as being like a top 100 player in the country. But just curious about how many other kids these filmmakers followed to see how their stories would develop, and some of them obviously probably not developing with the same kind of story arcs that these two did. Otherwise, if not, they got extremely lucky, because I think these were very interesting stories that were kind of also in some ways foils to each other. They complement each other well, because they're very different in the ways that they went about their high school careers.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think that's one of the more interesting aspects, and it'd be something fascinating to interview the actual filmmakers about is like, at what point did they choose these two kids? Were they, like you've talked about the possibility of them falling like 5 or 6 kids, and they just cut the other ones and stuff like that. So it's sort of like an interesting question on filmmaking and documentary filmmaking in specific.
Yeah. We talked one thing, comparing this to the More Than a Game, the documentary that follows LeBron James and his cohort of friends who go to St. Vincent, St. Mary's in Akron, Ohio. And one thing I was wondering about when we were watching this movie was seeing William go into the private school. He leaves his neighborhood, goes into a school that's primarily white. It's just a culture and a school system that he's not used to from what he's grown up with or what he's been to school with, and how that kind of wears on him over time, and we see him almost lose his passion for basketball.
I think at one point he does admit that he lost his passion to play.
Yeah.
It was to him more like a job, a way for him to get out. Like he didn't dislike it, but it seemed like he no longer wanted to be Michael Jordan, or he'd lost the dream of making it to the NBA.
Yeah, and it seemed like he had no connection really to his coach. Even at the end, I think he and the coach both agree that I think the coach says he had a good career, not a great career, and I think William says that his coach really never gave him much like mentoring advice, and you never really see him interact with his teammates on like a very personal level. It just made me really think, I guess, what LeBron and his team had was very special to have a group of guys who did go to a private school, but they kind of had each other's back and they were friends for so many years that I think that was probably one of the reasons that they were able to be so successful.
Yeah, and in the LeBron documentary, you get the feeling that, like, well, and of course it's filmmaking, so I don't know how much of it you can trust, but you get the feeling that they all legitimately still like each other to that day and stuff like that. And like in this film, I think it wouldn't be a stretch of the imagination to imagine that William Gates and the coach probably haven't spoken in a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, if anything, they probably would have spoken just because of this film.
Yeah, it seemed like when he says goodbye to his high school coach in the office, that's the last time they ever suspect to interact. And even the coach has a line that says, you know, one moves on, another one comes in. And
I know. Yeah, which was like one of the more shocking parts of it to me, because the camera doesn't even cut. It's like William walks out, camera pans back to the coach, Pingator or whatever his name was, and he says that line. Yeah. It's like, dang.
Yeah, that's pretty harsh. And he's still coaching there, right? We looked that up.
Yeah, he is, and he actually uses Hoop Dreams as a recruitment tool, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating how heavily he relied on Isaiah Thomas as his recruitment tool at that time. It seemed like we looked him up. I think that was his only player to ever go on to the NBA, but he really wanted to hold on to the fact that he coached Isaiah Thomas.
Yeah, and I mean, like at that time too, I mean, Isaiah would have been towards the height of his powers and stuff like that. So, and it's interesting to look at tangentially. Isaiah is sort of like a Chicago product when he's so associated with Detroit at this point.
I think we both were surprised about that. One thing also that's interesting is thinking about streetball culture. When you first get introduced to the two young men, it's like the late 80s, and they're actually Arthur is initially recruited playing streetball on a court in Chicago. So I think that's really kind of the tail end of the streetball culture, which we talked about when we reviewed White Man Can't Jump. But I think that's really a tail end where, you know, had this movie been filmed now, we probably would have had that scene existing in like an AAU gym where there's like a high school recruiter out watching young kids play.
Yeah, so he would have been even recruited at an earlier age, is what you're saying.
Yeah, definitely earlier age.
He would have been in the program already.
He would have already been in the program and just not been on a playground, which was interesting to see that.
Yeah, it's also interesting to see that the person that recruited him was someone that specialized in this. It wasn't necessarily a coincidence. It was someone that was literally scouring the courts, watching 13 and 14-year-olds play ball and tip off places like I forget what the school is called, but
and it makes sense why then, if we follow the evolution of AAU, why it becomes something there's so much money and corruption in it of you know, paying these scouts to go into the community and find who these kids are. Even at a high school level, it's pretty incredible.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think one of the other interesting things about the film, to go a little bit back, was just how we talked about how Arthur grew a lot slower than William did.
Yeah.
And to think about what would have happened if he had grown quicker or something like that, because he ends up leaving the school after a year. I mean, part of it is because it is more or less because he couldn't pay the bill.
Yeah,
right?
It was.
But for someone like William, there was a scholarship that was made available to him. And I don't think that's... I mean, the filmmaking makes it pretty clear that that's not a coincidence. So if you buy into that, I think there's a really reasonable chance that they could have been swapped if Arthur had grown quicker and stuff like that. Because by the end of it, Arthur has grown into a pretty good basketball player.
Yeah, he ends up leading his team, which is Marshall, which is one of the public schools in Chicago. He ends up leading them way deeper in the tournament than Williams' team ever goes at any point in his 4 years. William ends up starting for 4 years on the varsity team, but it ends up being Arthur who takes his team, I think, to the semifinals for state.
Yeah, which is a really interesting twist, because at certain points it seems like William is the one that has the chance. He has the shot to make it into the next level, and Arthur is kind of like playing on very mediocre inner city schools. He seems really immature compared to William, but ironically, and this is probably something that the filmmakers got very lucky that it sort of panned out this way, is that he ends up being the one, and William watches him go to state and watches him win a bunch of games.
Yeah, against a couple of future NBA players. I think we looked those guys up, some of the people he was playing against go on to play in the NBA. One thing that was interesting is we get to see a couple of scenes. It's only William who's recruited right out of high school to go into college, though Arthur does end up going on to play at Arkansas State. But William signs a letter of intent to Marquette, was it?
Yeah, which is a good basketball school.
Yeah, even at the time, it was a pretty solid program. But it was interesting seeing the conversations of the college recruiters with him and his family. They really, it seemed very stressful the way that they were presenting of, we want you to come and play for us, but we got to fill the spot. Yeah. And there's other guys that can play, and it just seemed very predatory almost.
It's a lot of sales tactics for sure.
Yeah.
It's like playing into the scarcity of it. It's like, we got 2 spots, we're offering this to 7.
Yeah.
First 2 to say yes, go.
Exactly. And it seemed like William potentially could have gotten scholarships from better schools. I know that schools like North Carolina and Duke,
Kansas
were all thrown out there, and his coach even advises him not to sign. But once those sales tactics come into him and his family, I think their anxiety spikes, and he ends up signing at Marquette.
Yep. Because they were the one that was offering it, and they were using those tactics to sort of get him to sign the paper.
And we see a little bit of that in He Got Game, but it was interesting to see that in kind of real time. Just the intensity of like the sales pitch. So yeah, one thing I also found interesting was how much you see this hoop dream is really not only the hoop dream of the athletes, but also like their older family who had similar dreams that didn't make it, how these dreams just kind of get compounded onto like the next generation. We see that William's brother was like a pretty well-respected and highly ranked high school player who got injured his senior year, it sounded like, and he never made it to the next level. So he kind of passes his dream on to William and has like the expectation that William will make it to kind of redeem his not making it. And same thing with Arthur's dad, who was like a big high school player who ended up not advancing to the next level, and he kind of puts all that dream back into Arthur. So just the pressure that these kids are carrying of like...
Yeah, of like their parents or their siblings living vicariously through them, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like every time you see William's brother, he's like holding a ball and has like a look of melancholy on his face.
Yeah.
As he's like remembering the days of like when he was playing.
Yeah, or he's doing some job that he doesn't want to do and just looking...
Yeah, I think really they
depressed.
tried to parallel his story with like... This is what could become of William if he doesn't make it. Yeah. To kind of show the high stakes, and he ends up, I think, getting killed in the end. Not during the film, but we hear down the road he's killed. Yeah.
And I believe Arthur's dad was too.
Yeah, they both were.
But William, I think his name was Curtis, his brother. Curtis Gates' story actually kind of reminds me a bit of Hoosiers, in the sense that it's like their best years were in their high school when they're sort of like getting glory and stuff, and like in Hoosiers the guy is a drunk. Curtis Gates I don't think is a drunk, or at least he's not shown that way, but he's thought of as like kind of a mess up in some sense, like so it's interesting that these sports, I don't know, storylines, common sports storylines, I don't want to say cliches, they're being hit in this very real drama.
Yeah. And I think it makes sense if, assuming that their lives played out similar to how William and Arthur's lives do, that, 100% all in on this one dream, and then when that doesn't amount to reality, it makes sense why you would fall really hard to, like, being unhappy with the way circumstances play out for you because the expectation was that you'd make the NBA, and there's really no narrative that's told to them otherwise.
Although William, you could see towards the end, is starting to develop his own narrative at the end. He's like, basketball isn't all that actually, which is kind of interesting to hear a high school kid say that.
Yeah.
But I think those are like mature and very reasonable words
Extremely,
to speak.
And it takes everybody by surprise because I think everybody is like also bought in onto his hoop dream. That when he starts saying like, I want to focus on my family, my academics, and I don't know if I want to play basketball anymore, everybody's just shocked and like can't believe that he's going to make that decision. And I think we hear he ends up playing 1 year at Marquette and then taking a scholarship and staying there but not continuing his career.
Yeah, I could hear Vince Carter somewhere
nodding
his head.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
Yeah, not to take a poke at him.
Yeah.
But, and I think the last thing that I wanted to mention was sort of like just the nature of documentaries are really interesting. So one thing I read when I was researching the film a little bit after we watched it was, I think it was Arthur, who said that just the act of making the film sort of made his life different or a little bit interesting because he basically had 3 white men, middle-class white men, following him around shooting the film, and then he would get picked on after the cameras left.
Okay.
And so, I don't know, it's kind of a sort of interesting thing. Another thing you commented on is there's 250 hours of footage. This film is long. It's 3 hours, but still, that leaves 247 hours that we're not seeing. So, I mean, always in these films, you can kind of pick and choose, and you can sort of like pick the narratives that you want, or you could try to steer it in the same way. It's like Curtis Gates. Was he always looking sad and depressed all the time, or did they just like pick out those moments to sort of develop it?
It's interesting. I think the only time in the film where we actually hear the voices of the filmmakers is they're actually kind of baiting Arthur to read an essay he wrote for school. Yeah, and he doesn't want to, and they kind of, you almost get the idea they want him to read it so that the viewers can see that he's like writing at like a grade level that's maybe below where he's supposed to be. It was just interesting that like, no, read it to us, we want to hear it. And he reads a little bit of it, but I thought it was so interesting just like pushing on him to like, because it comes on the back end of them talking about how his grades are slipping and they think he's falling behind in class, and then like the next scene is them like pestering him to like read a paper that he wrote. And I remember he reads it and it sounds like really well thought through and like gives a couple interesting analogies about butterflies. Yeah. It kind of like backfired, I think, from what they were hoping to portray him as, is like maybe being like either not illiterate but writing at a grade level that's like well behind what's expected. And he reads a little bit of it, and I think it's kind of like throws off what they were hoping to create in that scene.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's very interesting to think how the filmmaking itself sort of informs these characters' stories. And of course, in Hoop Dreams it did, in the sense that the film got big, and like it's probably one of the most seen films by especially potential NBA players. I forget who it was. It may have been Baron Davis or someone like that, but he watched the film and is like, this is literally the only film that I've ever seen that I can actually relate to.
Wow.
I don't know if it was Baron Davis.
Yeah.
But
it makes sense because Baron Davis is a big filmmaker now, or he's really big in film now.
Okay. Yeah, so that's interesting. And the last thing is, this is Hoop Dreams, not Hoop Reality.
Oh, not Hoop Reality.
Yeah.
Oh, gosh. We actually watched, I think, the trailer for it. Arthur Agee's in it, and coincidentally enough, was it Patrick Beverly?
Yeah.
Goes to the high school.
Marshall,
Arthur, goes to Marshall High School. So it kind of follows him with like Arthur as his mentor, and it looked pretty bad.
Yeah, and from what we read, it was pretty bad.
Yeah, I think the trailer's like one shot of Arthur Agee like talking in front of a whiteboard. Yeah, and it goes for like 2 minutes, and that's like with really poor audio. It's just not quite to the same standard as Hoop Dreams.
Yeah, so, I mean, there have been attempts to sort of cash in on this film's success, so to speak. Yeah. And I don't think the original filmmakers had much to do with it.
No, I don't think,
And I heard William Gates not even in it. So.
Yeah.
So.
Not quite the same.
Yeah.
But Hoop Dreams, definitely, I think, one of the better ones we've seen thus far.
Yeah, no, I think so, too. And it's hard to say, like, oh, I like this more than White Men Can't Jump, just because it's such a different film. Yeah. Like, it feels much more like a Boyhood or something like that to me. Like a very coming of age, very realistic. It really draws you into the characters. So I would definitely highly recommend it to anyone that was interested. Anyways, any closing words or?
No, I think we covered it all. I think what we have coming up, Above the Rim, starring Tupac Shakur.
Yeah.
And we have one of the documentaries that follows a local girls basketball team from Seattle, Washington. A couple other ones. I think we're almost through our list of basketball movies, but we have a few more coming up.
Yeah, so a couple more basketball films, maybe 1 or 2 more episodes, and we will see you guys next time.
Yeah, see you guys.